There is a document the United States government did not want you to read. It sat in classified archives for decades. It described, in the sterile language of science, how incarcerated men had their most intimate anatomy placed inside a box and bombarded with ionizing radiation, not to heal them, not to protect them, but to measure how much neutron exposure a human testicle could absorb before it stopped working forever. The men signed forms they did not fully understand. Some were told they were helping future astronauts. Some were told they were contributing to cancer research. What they were not told was that the scientists already suspected the answer would leave them permanently damaged. What they were not told was that the men running the experiment were funded by the same institution that had just detonated nuclear devices over populated islands and was quietly calculating how much radiation an American soldier could absorb and still fight. This happened in Oregon. This happened in Washington. This happened in 1963, while the country was building highways and sending rockets to the moon and telling the world it was the freest nation in human history. If this is the first time you are hearing about it, that is not an accident. If you have been finding your way to content like this, leave a like and subscribe. There is an entire architecture of suppressed history this channel is working through, one story at a time. Hit the notification bell so you do not miss what comes next. Let us go back. The year is 1963. The Cold War is not an abstraction. It is a daily calculation made by men in rooms you will never enter, about risks you will never be asked to vote on. The United States and the Soviet Union are racing in ways that have nothing to do with ideology and everything to do with institutional survival, survival of supply chains, survival of the military apparatus that has replaced what older historians used to call civilization. Both nations are testing nuclear weapons. Both nations are watching what those weapons do to human bodies. And both nations have a problem no one wants to say out loud. They do not actually know how much radiation a living person can absorb before they become useless to the war machine. This is not a peripheral question, this is the question. Because if you are going to fight a nuclear war, if you are going to send soldiers into irradiated zones and staff installations that might survive a first strike, you need to know what dose of radiation turns a fighting man into a liability. You need data, and data requires subjects. Dr. Carl Heller was an endocrinologist at Oregon Health Sciences University. He was also the principal investigator of what would eventually be known as the Oregon and Washington prison radiation experiments. Beginning in the late 1950s and running deep into the 1960s, Heller's program placed incarcerated men from the Oregon State Penitentiary and later the Washington State Penitentiary into a clinical protocol that involved exposing their testes to X-ray and neutron radiation and then monitoring what happened to their sperm counts, their hormone levels, and their capacity to reproduce. The funding came from the Atomic Energy Commission. The men received small cash payments, somewhere between $5 and $25 per session, depending on the account. Some received time off their sentences. The experiment ran for years. The official narrative, when it finally emerged, was that this was legitimate scientific inquiry that simply did not meet the ethical standards we now hold. That framing does something specific. It places the experiment inside a story of moral progress. We were less enlightened then, we know better now. The system corrected itself. What that framing does not allow you to ask is whether the experiment was ever really about the science it claimed to be about. What it does not allow you to ask is who built the system that made it possible, who benefited from its results, and what it tells us about the institutional structure that authorized it. When you ask those questions, something uncomfortable comes into focus. The Atomic Energy Commission was not simply a scientific body. It was one of the most powerful administrative structures in American history, a civilian agency with military authority, a budget dwarfing most federal departments, and the capacity to classify information, relocate populations, and conduct research with almost no public oversight. Born as the institutional successor to the Manhattan Project, it was immediately placed beyond democratic accountability. Its records were sealed. Its programs were compartmentalized. The men who ran it answered to a small number of elected officials and a larger number of people whose names appear in no textbook. When you find the AEC funding a program in which prisoners are having their reproductive organs irradiated, you are not looking at a rogue experiment. You are looking at a prioritized research objective. The AEC did not accidentally fund Karl Heller. It sought him out. It wanted what he was producing. That means, somewhere inside the apparatus, a decision was made that this information was worth acquiring, and a further decision was made that incarcerated men in Oregon and Washington were the appropriate population to acquire it from. That second decision is where the architecture of power becomes visible. The men in those prisons were disproportionately poor. Many were black. Many had been processed through a legal system that treated their bodies as state property in a way wealthier, whiter Americans' bodies were not. The experiment did not happen in a hospital or a research university. It happened in a prison, because in a prison, the consent of the subject is already structurally compromised. A man whose options have been narrowed to almost nothing can never quite freely agree to a medical experiment, no matter what the consent form says. This is not a coincidence of venue. This is a feature of the design. Now place this inside the broader context of mid-century American research programs, and something begins to clarify that the official narrative goes to considerable lengths to obscure. The AEC prison experiments did not occur in isolation. They occurred alongside the Tuskegee syphilis study, in which black men were deliberately denied treatment for a disease the researchers were monitoring. They occurred alongside Operation Sea Spray, in which the Navy sprayed bacterial agents over San Francisco to test dispersal patterns on an uninformed civilian population. They occurred alongside MK-Ultra, in which human subjects were dosed with psychoactive substances without consent in experiments spanning hospitals, prisons, and universities across North America. And they occurred while AEC above-ground nuclear tests were exposing downwinder communities in Utah and Nevada to fallout those residents were told was safe. What you are looking at, when you map all of these programs together, is not a series of isolated ethical failures. You are looking at a coherent institutional posture, a posture that treated certain categories of human beings as experimental material available for sovereign use. The language changes, the specific agencies change, but the underlying structure is consistent. Identify a population with limited capacity to refuse, create a legal framework that legitimizes access to their bodies, conduct the research, classify the results, and if the story escapes containment, describe it as a regrettable product of a less enlightened era. That is the pattern. And once you see it, the question you have to ask is not whether it has ended, but what it tells you about the nature of the system that produced it. There is a framework that has grown among researchers working outside official channels associated with what some call the suppressed continuity thesis that holds the institutional structures of modern Western civilization are not products of organic democratic development, but of a deliberately hidden reorganization of power. That reorganization spoke the language of liberty while encoding mechanisms of total control. It built prisons, universities, research hospitals, and classified agencies, and it used all of those structures for purposes never disclosed to the populations they claimed to serve. The prison radiation experiments are not a footnote to that thesis. They are its proof. Karl Heller's experiment was not exceptional. What made it eventually visible was not that it was worse than other programs, but that the documentation survived in a form that journalists and congressional investigators could access in the 1980s and 1990s. When the Advisory Committee on Human Radiation Experiments, convened by the Clinton administration in 1994, published its final report, it documented thousands of radiation experiments conducted on American citizens between 1944 and 1974. Most subjects were never told what had been done to them. Many had died. A significant number of surviving subjects were never located or informed, because the institutions that had used them had no interest in accounting for what they had done. The committee found experiments involving cancer patients given full-body irradiation not as treatment, but as research. It found newborns fed radioactive tracers. It found soldiers exposed to fallout during nuclear tests and then observed for health outcomes without their knowledge. At the center of this entire complex sat the same institutional signature, the Atomic Energy Commission, its contractor laboratories, and the network of university medical centers brought into its orbit through research funding. What the committee did not ask was who had decided these populations were available. It did not ask what theory of governance underwrote the conclusion that the state had sovereign access to the bodies of prisoners, soldiers, and patients for purposes those people could not know about. Those are the questions the official accounting of the prison radiation experiments is specifically structured to foreclose. Here is what the men in Oregon actually experienced. They lay on tables. A lead-lined box was positioned over their lower bodies. Their testes were placed through an opening in the box and exposed to a carefully calibrated beam of radiation. The dose varied by protocol. Some men received 8 rads, some received 400 rads, some received doses in between. For context, 400 rads of whole-body exposure would be lethal. Concentrated in the reproductive organs, it produced something the experimenters described in their notes as a useful and measurable outcome. It destroyed the men's capacity to produce viable sperm, sometimes temporarily, sometimes permanently. After each session, the men were monitored. They gave blood, they gave semen samples. They answered questions about their health. The data was compiled, analyzed, and transmitted to the Atomic Energy Commission. Before the program ended, some of the men underwent vasectomies. The official reason was to ensure they did not father children who might carry genetic damage from the radiation. The underlying reason is harder to find in the records. The researchers wanted to study testicular tissue directly, and a vasectomy provided the mechanism. The men were paid. The consent forms they signed described the procedure in general terms. Several of the men, when interviewed decades later by journalists and investigators, said they had not understood what was being done to them. Some said they had been told the effects were reversible. Some of those men had been rendered permanently sterile. Several of them developed testicular cancer in the years that followed. The connection between the experimental irradiation and the subsequent cancer was contested by the institutions involved and has never been formally adjudicated in a court that delivered meaningful compensation. This is the mechanism, not the dramatic violence of a secret police state, but the bureaucratic precision of a research program, consent forms that are technically present but practically coercive, information that is technically disclosed but practically withheld, outcomes that are technically monitored but practically denied when the subjects seek accountability. The experiment formally ended in 1971, when the AEC withdrew funding, and Oregon officials determined that the program could not survive public scrutiny. The men who had participated received no follow-up medical care from the state or federal government. The data that had been collected went into the archive. Carl Heller died in 1988. The records became accessible in the early 1990s. In 1996, 11 surviving participants filed a class action lawsuit. They settled in 2000 for $2.4 million, total roughly $200,000 per man, for an experiment that had irradiated their reproductive organs, destroyed fertility in some cases, and in some cases preceded cancer. The institutions involved did not admit liability. The settlement contained language specifically preserving their right to deny that the experiment had caused the injuries the men experienced. That is what accountability looks like inside the system that produced the experiment: a number, a signature, and a clause that says this payment does not mean we did anything wrong. The broader lesson, and this is what the suppressed continuity framework helps make visible, is that the structures of the modern administrative state are not neutral bureaucracies that occasionally produce ethical failures. They are systems with embedded incentives and embedded assumptions about which human beings have sovereignty over their own bodies and which are available to the designs of those who operate the system. The prison radiation experiments did not violate the principles of that system. They express them. When you understand that, you understand something that changes how you read every official account of history ever offered to you. The version you received through school curricula and mainstream media and government reports was not simply incomplete, it was architecturally incomplete. Designed, at the level of its organizing assumptions, to produce a population that would not ask the questions that make the architecture visible. You are asking those questions now. The men in Oregon and Washington who lay on those tables in 1963 did not know they were participating in a program that would eventually become a footnote in a congressional report. They did not know their experience would be described, 30 years later, as a regrettable artifact of a less enlightened time. They knew only what they felt, the clinical cold of the room, the weight of the lead box, the small cash payment afterward, and eventually, for some of them, the knowledge that something inside them had changed in a way that could not be undone. Their names are in the archive. The institution that used them has continued, in reorganized forms, to exist and to operate with the same fundamental authority over the same categories of human beings. The question the official history does not ask is the question you should be sitting with. If this was happening in 1963, sanctioned by the Atomic Energy Commission, conducted in institutions supposed to protect the people inside them, what is the equivalent program running now, in facilities you cannot access, with subjects who have not been told what is being done to them, producing data that will not be declassified until everyone involved is dead? That question does not have a comfortable answer. It has only the discipline of continued attention, the refusal to accept that the version of history you were given is the version that actually happened, and the willingness to keep looking at what the documents reveal when they finally surface.